I'm going to start by talking for just 5 or 10 minutes about some context and definitions of just transition, so that we can get some shared definitions and an understanding of what we're talking about, since as we learned from that word cloud, the phrase can mean so many different things to different people. And then we're going to hear from our 5 wonderful contributors. So as I said, Rakesh, Pauline, Yaz, Rose and Steve have all joined us tonight. And then we'll have a break in the middle where Rob is going to lead us in an imagination exercise, and we'll have a short comfort break, hopefully around 8 o'clock. And then we should have 20 minutes at the end to head into breakout rooms with 1 contributor in each room so that you can have the chance to ask questions and have a discussion in smaller groups. And we should be closing up around 9 if we're good with our timings. So hold us to that. So let's start with a little bit of history and context around just transition more widely, and then we'll talk specifically about where the transition movement fits into this bigger picture. So the phrase just transition comes originally from the US labor and environmental justice movements. It comes out of the uniting of interests of trade unions and campaigners focused on environmental injustice. But it's also been widely and increasingly used in the UK, especially in Scotland, where there's actually a Just Transition Commission at government level, as well as a really established grassroots campaign. And I personally first came across the phrase just transition when I lived in Aberdeen, where it's mostly used to refer to moving away from oil and gas, without sacrificing the economic, social and cultural security of communities who rely on that industry. And I do really, really firmly believe that we can't separate calls for a just transition from workers' rights and from the important work that trade unions are doing. But I also feel really strongly that a just transition isn't only about workers and extractive industries. There's so much power in it being a call for transition in all industries and for the transformation of our economic, political and social systems at the same time. I find the phrase transition is inevitable, justice is not really helpful here. I imagine you might have come across it before. It refers to the fact that the climate, ecological and environmental crises mean that some kind of transition is going to happen, but there's no guarantee that it will lead to a more socially just world than the one that we have now. And unfortunately, a lot of the solutions which are being proposed or already enacted to reduce carbon emissions have consequences which lead to more injustice, more exclusion and more inequality at both national and international levels. But on a more positive note, at the same time, it's also a really exciting opportunity to do things differently. We can use this inevitable transition as an opportunity to build futures which are more socially just, equitable and fair. So this is a really wordy but really interesting definition from the Climate Justice Alliance, who've been a big part in work around just transition in the US. I know it's long, but we are going to break it down. They define just transition as a vision-led, unifying and place-based set of principles, processes and practices that build economic and political power to shift from an extractive economy to a regenerative one. And thinking about it through a transition lens and kind of breaking it down a little bit. To me, vision-led means putting imagination at the heart, which I think we can all agree we're pretty good at. Unifying means seeing this as an opportunity for cohesion and for bringing folks together rather than entrenching divisions. Place-based means situating a just transition in communities and recognising the value of acting at a local level. Again, something I think transition groups are already actively doing, or I know transition groups are already actively doing. And using these 3 words, principles, processes and practices, apart from being a tongue twister, means that just transition is both a set of values and an active and live process that we can participate in and contribute to. And then in terms of the last bit, the next slide is going to expand a bit more on the meaning behind shifting from an extractive economy to a regenerative one. So I find this framework really helpful. It's also from the Climate Justice Alliance, but I do realise that the text is probably really small on your screens. So don't worry if you can't read all of it. I'm going to talk through it and we'll also send around these slides afterwards so you can kind of zoom in and have a closer look at it. Essentially, it frames just transition as something which involves stopping the harmful practices while simultaneously building alternatives. So looking at this kind of left side of the screen under extractive economy, this is unfortunately where most of the world is currently operating. In this framework, they define an extractive economy as one with consumerism and colonialism as the core mindset, the enclosure of wealth and power being the main purpose, and extraction of resources being a core part of how the economy functions. So we have economic, political and social systems which are inherently exploitative both to the environment and to most communities. So just transition would combine the stopping of the system, and you can see over here, very small, it says stop the bad, stopping this system and the harm that it creates with building a regenerative system which prioritises both the rights of humans and the rights of the planet over profit and power. So this arrow in the middle, it says on the left here, I don't know if you can read it, but it says stopping the bad, and it says building the new on the right. And in the middle, it says solutions that are visionary and oppositional. So it's combining stopping the bad with building the new. And then on the right, under this regenerative economy setting, we have a regenerative economy with care at the centre, the purpose being ecological and social well-being, and the resource use model being based on regeneration. So in terms of where transition groups fit in, there's lots of groups in the UK who are already doing really important work around stopping the bad, including some transition groups like Transition Heathrow, who we're going to hear from a bit later. But I think where transition groups are especially well placed is in this role of building the new. So transition groups who we're going to hear from tonight, as well as hundreds of others, are actively creating regenerative economies in their communities and doing this role of building the new. And I'm sure we would all agree that our communities can act as microcosms for the rest of society. This means that initiatives at a local level have the power to enforce change on a larger scale, but it also means that forces of oppression in the rest of society can and do manifest at a community level. So alongside our work in building alternatives, we also need to acknowledge how they can replicate harmful systems and work on minimising this. Yaz is going to talk more about how this work fits into a just transition just later on tonight. So I think looking at it this way, we can see, and I've said it before and I will say it again, that just transition really is an opportunity. It's an opportunity to transform everything from the way we heat our homes to the way that we interact with people. And transition groups are really well placed to contribute to that. I'm going to finish up soon, but I think first it's really important to look at how we situate ourselves in the movement for a global just transition. I'm sure you are all well aware that inequality in the UK is rising alongside global inequality. So recently, the UK Poverty Report for 2024 found that poverty in the UK has increased close to pre-pandemic levels. And just back in January, Oxfam's Inequality Report found that not only have 5 billion people globally become poorer since 2020, at the same time, the richest 5 men in the world have doubled their worth, and we could be on track to have the world's first trillionaire in the next 10 years, which is just insane. And climate and environmental injustice add an extra dimension to this economic inequality, because the impacts of climate and environmental change aren't distributed evenly, as I'm sure we're all well aware. It's often the nations and communities who've done the least to contribute who suffer the most consequences. So campaigns for reparations, addressing the dual impacts of capitalism and colonialism, and addressing power imbalances are all part of a global just transition. And I think it's really important to situate ourselves in this global. The really good news is that focusing on the change that we can make at a local level can have impacts internationally, and also that seeing ourselves as part of a worldwide movement for climate and environmental justice is really empowering. And I'm really looking forward to hearing more from Rakesh later about his work on decolonising permaculture. So I guess essentially what I'm saying is that just transition plus community-led change equals collective liberation. I really wish it was that simple. It's definitely not. And there's obviously much more to the picture. But I do firmly believe that there's massive power in community-led change to be part of a just transition and contribute towards collective liberation. Transition groups and our wider communities have a really important role to play. Ultimately, I think the key to this is situating ourselves in a broader movement. And thinking back to that framework that I shared a few slides ago, as the transition movement, we're only one part of that massive picture. But what we can do is work alongside and in active solidarity with groups, organisations, activists, trade unionists, and others who are all pushing and pulling at those levers of power to move us from an extractive economy to a regenerative one. I'm aware that this has been a bit of a whistle-stop tour, or a big whistle-stop tour, but there's so much more to this. We'll have opportunities, I hope, to dive into some of the areas that we've touched on briefly in other spaces, but hopefully it's given us a little bit of a shared framework to start from.